They thought he was just another black man to intimidate, another face in a mugshot, another name to stamp, file, and forget. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning in Chicago, something extraordinary happened. A courtroom that had silenced voices for decades suddenly cracked wide open. The judge, who sat like a monarch on her throne, untouchable for 25 years, became the one answering questions she never thought she'd have to face. What unfolded inside courtroom 5A at the Cook County Courthouse didn't just free one man, it exposed a system, shook a city, and changed the quiet rules of justice forever. Dear viewer, this is not just a story. This is a living testament to the power that sleeps in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it. If this is your first time here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If stories like this stir your soul, challenge your thinking, or light a fire in your chest, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and let's keep these voices alive. Thank you for being here. Now, pull up a chair. Let's walk through every heartbeat of this day, because you won't want to miss a single second. It was 8:27 a.m. on a crisp fall morning in Chicago, the kind where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through your coat and reminds you the city never sleeps. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 5A at the Cook County Courthouse groaned open like an old man waking from a long nap. The room was already half full. A mosaic of quiet murmurs, crossed arms, and shifting eyes filled the wooden benches. Coffee steam curled from paper cups. A bailiff adjusted his belt. A court reporter flexed her fingers over the stenograph machine. There was something electric in the air that morning, something that clung to the oak-paneled walls with the weight of unspoken truths. The locals called it the Harlan effect. Attorneys knew it by reputation. Defendants feared it in their nightmares. And anyone who had ever practiced law in this corner of Illinois had felt its sting at least once. Judge Elizabeth Harlan had presided over this courtroom for 25 years. She was 62, silver hair pulled into a tight, flawless bun, black robe pressed and starched like armor. Her glasses sat low on her nose, sharp as her tongue. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her words cut cleaner than any gavel slam ever could. Her bench wasn't just a seat, it was a throne. And she wore her robe like chainmail, wielding it with precision, authority, and when it suited her, cruelty. People said she never forgot a name, especially the ones she didn't like. Names like Marcus Reed. He wasn't new to her courtroom. But he was a problem. At 46, Marcus Reed had already built a name that stretched far beyond his Loop law firm on LaSalle Street. He had argued in front of federal judges in D.C., sat on national panels about race and justice reform, and once cross-examined a U.S. senator on live television. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his resume. It was his composure. While others cracked under subtle threats or biting condescension, Marcus studied it. He memorized it. He let it talk until it contradicted itself. Today, he stepped into courtroom 5A not just as a defense attorney, but as a storm cloaked in a calm Navy suit. His eyes scanned the room not in intimidation, but in calculation. Every bench, every bailiff, every eye that flicked toward him and then away. He moved like he belonged, even in a place designed to remind him he didn't. The case was People versus Jordan Harris, a 38-year-old black man, a decorated Marine veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, now accused of assaulting an officer during a traffic stop on the South Side. The footage, partially leaked to a local news blog, painted a far more complicated picture. Jordan had been pulled over for a broken taillight. He was seated in his car, hands visible on the steering wheel. No weapon, no resistance. Then, without warning, he was tased. The officer claimed Jordan swung first. The body cam started after the struggle. Convenient. But nuance rarely held weight in Judge Harlan's courtroom. Here, narrative ruled. And Jordan's narrative was one she had already rewritten in her head. Jordan sat beside Marcus, wrists shackled with cold steel, shoulders hunched like a man carrying the weight of the world. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He hadn't eaten well in weeks. His eyes scanned the floor like it had betrayed him. Marcus leaned close and whispered, "You're not what they say you are. I just need you to trust me to prove it." Jordan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. A flicker of something, hope maybe, crossed his face. The room quieted as the side door opened with a soft click. Judge Harlan stepped in. She walked like she was stepping onto a stage at the Chicago theater, every movement choreographed, every heel strike a note in her silent symphony. Her black pumps echoed across the tile with chilling rhythm. She took her seat behind the bench, adjusted her glasses, and looked straight ahead without acknowledgement of anyone in the room. Then her eyes landed on Marcus. A thin smile touched her lips, not warm, but knowing. She adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, tapped her pen once, then leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice smooth like silk pulled too tightly. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Chicago's courtroom's not quite high-profile enough for you these days." It was meant as a jab, dressed in civility. Marcus didn't blink. "I go where justice fails, Your Honor. That tends to be in more places than I'd like." The courtroom shifted. A few eyebrows raised. A bailiff straightened his posture. But Judge Harlan only smiled wider, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Well," she said, looking back to her docket, "try to keep the soapbox moments to a minimum. We're not filming a documentary here." She laughed softly to herself. The laughter echoed longer than it should have. And just like that, the stage was set. Opening statements were scheduled for 10 a.m. The gallery was full. Reporters had begun to trickle in, not because of the case itself, but because word had gotten out. Marcus Reed was going head-to-head with Chicago's Iron Lady. It wasn't a trial. It was a showdown. And those didn't happen often. Jordan sat quietly beside Marcus, visibly tense. He glanced once toward the jury box, still empty, but already sensing he didn't stand a chance. Marcus placed a hand gently on the table, a silent signal of stability. He knew this wasn't about Jordan alone. This was about every Jordan who never got their name cleared, every black defendant who was spoken over, passed over, walked over. And Judge Harlan, she knew it too. She tilted her head, scanning the room like a director preparing for curtain call. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and said, "Let's make one thing clear, Mr. Reed. I don't tolerate grandstanding, race-baiting, or courtroom theatrics. If you're planning on putting on a show, I suggest you take it to the Steppenwolf Theater." Marcus nodded slowly. "I've come to present evidence, Your Honor. But if what you're doing here qualifies as theater, I'll simply play my part." The room froze. The silence wasn't awkward. It was loaded. A few murmurs swirled in the back row. One reporter started scribbling faster. Harlan's jaw clenched. This wasn't going to be another trial. It was going to be a reckoning. Neither of them would say it. Not yet. But everyone could feel it. What no one could know was that before the sun set on this courtroom, the woman who just laughed at Marcus Reed would be escorted out, not as a judge, but as a suspect. The fall always starts at the top, and Harlan had no idea she'd already begun to slip. The courtroom had always been her domain, a place where the walls seemed to lean inward toward her bench like disciples drawn to a prophet. Judge Elizabeth Harlan didn't just preside. She commanded, orchestrating each trial like a composer guiding her personal symphony of control. That morning, as she adjusted her robe with the poise of someone utterly assured of her own power, she had no idea the structure she had built, one of intimidation and silent compliance, was beginning to fracture. Not from the outside, but from the inside. Marcus Reed stood at the defense table, his posture calm but coiled like a spring. His client, Jordan Harris, sat beside him, present in body but visibly absent in spirit. Marcus had seen that look too many times. The look of a black man dragged into a courtroom not for justice, but for punishment, pre-approved by tradition, procedure, and prejudice. Judge Harlan began the morning proceedings with an edge sharper than necessary. "Mr. Reed, are we ready to begin? Or are you still organizing your theater props?" she asked, her eyes already darting to the court reporter before he could answer. "We're ready, Your Honor," Marcus replied evenly. He had no interest in matching her pettiness, only in exposing it. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Ethan Kowalski, barely concealed his smirk. At 32, Kowalski was young, white, ambitious, and precisely the type Harlan favored. Pliable, eager, willing to weaponize procedure for the sake of appearances. He rose with confidence, smoothing his tie like a badge of righteousness. As opening statements began, Kowalski painted Jordan as agitated, threatening, and dangerous. using terms that masked their racial undertones with legal ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this defendant represents a clear and present danger to law enforcement." He resisted. He assaulted. He endangered lives. The jury leaned in. Some nodded. Marcus watched silently, hands folded, letting the performance unfold. Then it was his turn. Marcus rose slowly, his voice clear, measured, and unshaken as he addressed the jury. "Jordan Harris is a father, a decorated Marine who served this country with honor, a man who came home to coach Little League and raise his daughters. The prosecution wants to convince you that he is defined by a single moment, one we intend to prove never occurred the way they say it did." He took a breath, then continued. "But I ask you, what if the system is more comfortable believing he's guilty than asking if it was wrong?" Before Marcus could sit down, Harlan cut in like a guillotine. "Mr. Reed, you will refrain from philosophical grandstanding. This court deals in facts, not moral hypotheticals." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The subtle shift in the jury's body language told him they had heard what mattered. The trial pressed on. Each exchange grew more tense than the last. Marcus cross-examined the arresting officer, pointing out discrepancies in his written report versus his testimony. He questioned why the body cam footage began after the most critical moment. He challenged the lack of any physical evidence tying Jordan to the alleged assault. No bruises on the officer, no DNA, no witnesses. Each time he made headway, Harlan found a way to undercut him. "Objection. Relevance," Kowalski would call out. "Sustained," Harlan replied before Marcus could finish his sentence. Objection leading, sustained, objection, argumentative, sustained. It was a rhythm, a pattern, one so precise it didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The walls of her courtroom didn't just echo her decisions. They amplified them, but what Harlan failed to recognize was how visible her hand had become. The jury, though silent, had begun to fidget. A woman in the back row of the gallery, who had sat stone-faced through the first hour, now leaned forward, eyes wide. Even the court reporter's pen strokes seemed more deliberate, as if bracing for history. Then came the moment that would cement the unraveling. Marcus called a new witness, an independent forensic analyst who had reviewed the footage and timing discrepancies. Before the man could complete his third sentence, Kowalski objected. "Your Honor, this witness wasn't disclosed in our original pretrial documents." Marcus stepped forward calmly. "That's false. His name was included in the amended list submitted to the clerk's office last Wednesday, time-stamped and filed." Harlan narrowed her eyes. "I don't recall seeing such an amendment." "I have the time-stamped copy here, Your Honor," Marcus said, lifting a document. She didn't ask for it. Instead, she turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, please disregard the last few statements. The defense has attempted to introduce surprise evidence without proper notification." Marcus's voice dropped a register. "Your Honor, with respect, the only thing being surprised here is the truth." The room froze. Harlan's eyes flared. "One more comment like that, Mr. Reed, and you'll be held in contempt." Marcus didn't break eye contact. "Contempt," he repeated softly, "is watching justice be strangled by formality." For the first time, she hesitated. Then she snapped. "Enough! This witness is dismissed." The forensic analyst stepped down, confused and shaken. But Marcus didn't protest. He didn't fight. Instead, he turned to his client. Jordan's hands gripped the edge of the table. His face was tight, breath controlled, like a man trying not to drown in a storm he couldn't even name. Marcus leaned in and whispered, "We're not losing. We're collecting glances, notes, violations. Every cut, every dodge, every moment Harlan tried to silence me is being written into a separate record, one she will never be able to edit." Outside the courtroom, the air was shifting. Quiet murmurs were building momentum in the courthouse hallways. The local press, usually indifferent to the quiet tragedies of the courtroom, had taken notice. Something in this case, perhaps Marcus's unwavering poise, perhaps Harlan's blatant bias, had cracked the dam of indifference, and inside, as the prosecution rested its case and the court recessed for lunch, Judge Harlan sat straighter than ever, satisfied with the control she thought she had maintained. But Marcus Reed knew better. He knew this wasn't about winning over the judge. It was about letting the walls speak louder than the bench. And before the end of the day, those walls would begin to crumble. As the courtroom buzzed faintly during the lunch recess, Marcus Reed remained seated at the defense table, alone, silent, turning a small flash drive in his hand like a loaded bullet. It was no bigger than a matchbox, matte black, no markings. It had arrived that very morning, slipped into a plain manila envelope and left anonymously at the front desk of his Michigan Avenue hotel. No note, no return address. Only 3 words scrawled in slanted handwriting on a torn scrap of paper. Play this before closing arguments. Marcus wasn't one to gamble on mystery. He had built his career on evidence, hard, documented, undeniable. But something in his gut, forged from years of seeing the system twist truth into knots, told him this wasn't a prank. This wasn't a bluff. This was a lifeline. His client, Jordan Harris, had been escorted out with a deputy for a brief lunch break. Sandwich, water, back in cuffs. Marcus stayed behind. The room hummed with the low murmur of court clerks packing files, reporters recharging phones, bailiffs joking about weekend plans. No one noticed him plug the drive into his laptop. No one saw him click the lone video file. What filled the screen stopped his breath cold. It was courtroom 5A, 3 years earlier. Same oak paneling, same American flag in the corner, same bench. Judge Elizabeth Harlan sat exactly where she would sit in 2 hours, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, silver bun perfect. A black defendant stood at the podium, barely audible, pleading his case. She cut him off mid-sentence with that familiar icy tone, but that wasn't the shock. What followed was a private sidebar, accidentally left recording on the courtroom microphone. Harlan leaned toward the prosecutor, unaware the mic was live. Her voice clear, casual, cruel, he'll plead. They always do. Just push him a little harder. We'll move this along. I don't have time to waste on another one of them. Marcus leaned back in his chair. His pulse thundered in his ears. The casual racism, the manipulation, the routine dismissal of a human life. It wasn't just present. It was documented, captured, preserved, and suddenly, everything made sense. The blocked witnesses, the thrown-out evidence, the disproportionate rulings, the way Harlan shut down every attempt to humanize Jordan. It wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration. Marcus's hand hovered over the keyboard. He weighed the nuclear option. If he played this in open court, it would be irreversible. He could destroy her career in seconds, end a 25-year reign with one click. But was the timing right? Was the jury ready? Was he ready for the fallout? Just then, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. No name, no context. Just 8 words. You're not the only one. She's buried. Time to dig her up. He stared at the screen. Then at the flash drive. Then at the empty jury box. His decision was made. 15 p.m. Court reconvened. The room settled into its familiar hierarchy. Judge Harlan returned as poised as ever, robe crisp, chin high, eyes skimming past Marcus with the faintest smirk like a cat toying with a cornered mouse. But Marcus didn't flinch. Because now he held something she couldn't interrupt, overrule, or dismiss, and he was about to press play. When the court resumed after lunch, the walls of courtroom 5A seemed quieter than before. But it wasn't the kind of silence that calms. It was the kind that coils itself around your ribs and waits for something to snap. Judge Elizabeth Harlan took her seat with the air of someone who believed she had already won. Her posture proud, her voice just a touch more clipped than it had been in the morning session. But if she noticed the difference in the atmosphere, the way a juror paused slightly before sitting, the glance exchanged between 2 spectators in the back row, even the bailiff avoiding eye contact for the first time, she didn't show it. Or perhaps she did, and simply didn't care. Marcus Reed, however, noticed everything. He had seen it before, the slow erosion of fear, the moment when silence begins to feel like complicity. And now, he had something more powerful than any legal brief or carefully worded motion. He had evidence, a truth caught on camera, not staged, not edited, but raw and damning. What had been whispered in corners for years was now a recording waiting to be heard. And in less than an hour, It would play in a courtroom that had silenced voices like his for decades. But for now, he waited. The court moved into closing arguments. Assistant State's Attorney Ethan Kowalski rose first, smoothing his tie as if it were a badge of righteousness. His voice rang with that practiced, confident cadence of someone convinced that if he hit the right tone, the facts wouldn't matter. He painted Jordan Harris as a man who had snapped, who had disrespected lawful authority, who was a threat to civil order. "This is not about race," he insisted. "This is about accountability." It was a performance. And Harlan watched approvingly, her chin nodding almost imperceptibly, like a metronome keeping the rhythm of his closing cadence. When Kowalski finished, Marcus rose. No theatrics, no pacing, no gesturing. He stood with his hands resting lightly on the defense table, eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the gallery, but on the jurors, on the people who still had a choice to make. Jordan Harris did not snap. He began, his voice calm, steady, filling every corner of the room. He didn't swing. He didn't threaten. He didn't resist. What he did was something far more threatening to a system that doesn't expect people like him to speak at all. He stayed calm. He asked questions. He asked for respect. He let that word hang in the air. Respect. He repeated it, slower this time. Respect is not a privilege. It's a right. And when the footage we showed earlier was suppressed, when testimony was cut off, when every attempt to explain was overruled, you saw what happens when that right is stripped. Judge Harlan shifted slightly in her seat. Marcus could see her fingers tighten around her pen. And maybe, he continued, you felt it too, not the fear of being arrested, but the fear of being unheard, of being dismissed before your words ever leave your mouth. That's what Jordan felt that night. That's what many of us feel every day. He turned slowly toward the judge's bench. And in some rooms, in some courts, that silence isn't an accident. It's by design. A pin could have dropped. He stepped back from the podium, nodding once toward Jordan, whose eyes met his for the first time that day, not with fear, but with something close to hope. Thank you. Mr. Reed, Harlan said, her voice tight, clipped. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will now begin deliberations. But she didn't finish, because Marcus raised his hand, calmly, decisively. Your Honor, before the jury is dismissed, the defense has one final submission. Newly surfaced material directly relevant to this trial's impartiality. Harlan's eyes narrowed to slits. The time for evidence has passed, Mr. Reed. This is not evidence against my client, Marcus said smoothly. It's evidence regarding this court. The room stiffened. Proceed carefully, Harlan warned, her tone a blade. Marcus took a breath. Then, without another word, he reached over to the laptop on the table, turned it toward the court's projection screen, and pressed play. A grainy video flickered to life. Courtroom 5A, 3 years ago. Harlan on the bench. Her voice clear as crystal. They always plead. Just push him! I don't have time for another one of them. The audio filled the room like a bomb detonation, not shouted, not exaggerated, just said with a cruel kind of routine, gasps, murmurs. One juror covered her mouth. Another leaned forward as if to make sure what they were hearing was real. Harlan's gavel slammed down, once, twice. Turn that off. This is inappropriate. It's your voice, Marcus said, unmoved. This is what you said in this courtroom about a defendant who looked like my client. You didn't care about the facts then, and you don't now. I said turn it off. Harlan snapped, rising from her chair, face flushed. I will, Marcus said, once you answer for it. The bailiff stood frozen, unsure whether to move toward the bench or the projector. Marcus looked directly at the jury. You've heard a lot this week, but what you just heard tells you everything you need to know about how this trial was handled. Jordan Harris sat frozen, staring up at the judge who only minutes before had looked untouchable. Now the robe seemed heavier, the authority thinner. The room had turned, and Marcus Reed stood at its center, not shouting, not pleading, just shining a light into the darkest. Corner, the storm hadn't erupted yet, but the clouds were cracking, and Elizabeth Harlan had just heard the thunder. The silence that followed the playback was unlike anything Courtroom 5A had ever known. It wasn't the silence of routine decorum or quiet respect. It was the kind that seeps into your bones, the kind that announces something sacred has just been shattered. Judge Elizabeth Harlan stood behind her bench, visibly shaken, though she tried to keep her expression composed. But no amount of poise could erase what had just played for all to hear. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a truth laid bare, a truth that had lived in whispers, in quiet nods between attorneys, in the resignation of defendants who understood the game was never meant for them. And now, the mask had fallen. The voice in the video wasn't just recognizable. It was unmistakably hers. In the jury box, eyes flicked nervously between each other. The gallery sat stunned. Even the reporters, who had once doubted the relevance of this case, now scribbled furiously. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so suddenly, so irreversibly, that the space itself felt unrecognizable. Marcus Reed said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped back and let the weight of the moment land where it belonged, on Harlan. On every ruling she had made. On every life she had quietly twisted beneath the gavel. She reached for her gavel now, instinctively, but the room didn't yield as it once did. Her voice, though firm, now trembled beneath its practiced veneer. This proceeding is adjourned until further review. A door opened at the back of the courtroom. 2 U.S. Marshals entered, one holding a sealed envelope, the other moving with practiced, deliberate steps. The judge's words caught mid-air. She looked up, trying to recenter herself, but her eyes betrayed the truth. She knew what was coming. "Judge Elizabeth Harlan," the lead marshal said, loud enough for all to hear. "You are being placed under investigation for judicial misconduct, violation of due process, and racially biased rulings spanning multiple cases. You are hereby relieved of duty pending federal inquiry." Her lips parted, but no words came. For a moment, she just stood there. This woman who had towered over the system like a shadow, suddenly small. The gavel she gripped didn't fall. Her power had already slipped from her fingers. As the marshals escorted her from the bench, no one in the courtroom moved. It wasn't fear. It was awe. They weren't witnessing a fall. They were witnessing a reckoning. Marcus turned to Jordan, whose chains had just become meaningless. "This," he said quietly, "is what accountability looks like, and for the first time in that courtroom's history, justice wasn't handed down from the bench. It rose from the floor. The courtroom remained hushed long after Judge Elizabeth Harlan was escorted away, as if the space itself was trying to understand what had just happened. What had once been her domain now belonged to no one. Yet amidst the debris of her collapsed authority, something else began to rise. Clarity. The newly assigned judge, an experienced, even-tempered man named Harold Winfield, took the bench with calm gravity. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone reminded everyone that justice was still possible, even after so much rot had been exposed. With the eyes of the nation now on the case, Winfield moved swiftly but deliberately. He reviewed the mistrial motion submitted by Marcus Reed, flipping through the documentation with a focus that felt refreshing in its fairness. There was no scoffing, no thinly veiled sarcasm, just the solemn responsibility of the law, finally applied without prejudice. Marcus stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, this courtroom is not just a place for verdicts. It is a place for repair. For my client to be free, it isn't enough that Judge Harlan is gone. He deserves a ruling that sees him." Jordan Harris sat motionless beside him, his eyes still clouded with the residue of trauma. He had walked into that courtroom expecting to be convicted. What he never expected was to see the very foundation of that injustice crumble. Judge Winfield nodded. "I've reviewed the trial record, the newly submitted evidence, and the conduct of the prior proceedings." He paused, his voice gaining weight. "This court finds that the rights of Mr. Harris were egregiously violated and that the case was conducted under a climate of judicial bias unbefitting any standard of due process. He turned to Jordan. Mr. Harris, you are hereby exonerated of all charges. You are free to go. There was no outburst. No cheering, just silence, deep, reverent, shaking silence, the kind that holds a dignity louder than applause. Jordan's eyes widened, then dropped to his hands, which slowly opened as though releasing something he'd been gripping for far too long. Marcus placed a steady hand on his client's shoulder. "It's over," he said softly, but they both knew. It wasn't truly over. Not for the countless others who never had a Marcus in their corner, who never had a recording fall into the right hands, who never saw their judge unmasked. Still, this was something, a beginning, a ripple, a shift, and as Jordan stood, unchained, seen, whole, the verdict that mattered wasn't just written into the record, it was carved into history. In the quiet that followed Jordan Harris's release, the walls of the Cook County Courthouse stood as silent witnesses to a day that would be remembered for far more than one man's trial. The space that once echoed with Judge Elizabeth Harlan's cold authority now hummed with something deeper, transformation. For years, the court had operated under her gavel's weight, issuing judgments that carried not only legal consequences, but the shadow of bias too heavy to name out loud. Her word had once been final. Her demeanor, untouchable, but like all systems built on unchecked power and whispered corruption, hers eventually cracked, and in the space of that fracture, truth spilled out. Marcus Reed didn't walk into the courtroom to become a hero. He came in to defend a man named Jordan, a man like many others, misunderstood, misrepresented, and if not for the intervention of one determined voice, misjudged. Marcus had seen it before, judges who condescended, prosecutors who played politics with people's lives, and the silent machinery of racism grinding down the dignity of those who lacked the privilege to push back. But what made this case different wasn't just the client. It was the timing, the preparation, and the moment the system finally exposed itself. From the very beginning, the odds were stacked. Jordan had done nothing to deserve arrest, let alone a trial. He had been polite, cooperative, calm during a police encounter gone wrong. But he fit the description, a phrase that has become a tragic anthem in American injustice. He was presumed guilty long before he stepped into that courtroom, and Judge Harlan, cloaked in her years of unchallenged authority, saw no reason to question that presumption. Her smirks, her interruptions, her open disdain. It was all part of a script she'd followed for decades, but Marcus had done his homework. He knew this wouldn't be just another cross-examination. He came with more than legal arguments. He came with truth. And when he played the video, when Harlan's own voice laid bare her prejudice, everything changed. In one clip, the mask she wore for years shattered. No longer was it rumor or speculation. It was reality, undeniable and public. The fallout was immediate. U.S. Marshals walked into her courtroom and escorted her away from the bench she once ruled like a monarch. The power she used to dismiss people with a glance now meant nothing. In her place, justice found its way back into the room through Judge Winfield, who reminded everyone that fairness doesn't require a robe. It requires courage. For Jordan, the verdict changed his life. But the real victory wasn't just his freedom. It was the acknowledgement of a system that had failed him, and finally tried, in some small way, to make that right. His exoneration wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of healing, not just for him, but for all the invisible people who saw themselves in his place. And Marcus? He left the courtroom not as a man seeking applause, but as someone who understood the work ahead. Because the system didn't fall with Harlan, it flinched. And flinching isn't enough. For every Harlan, there are dozens more, draped in legal language and professional detachment, slowly stealing justice behind the guise of procedure. The lesson in this story runs deeper than courtroom. Walls, it reminds us that silence is dangerous, especially when it masquerades as professionalism. That neutrality in the face of injustice is not virtue. It is complicity, and that real change rarely comes from shouting. It comes from unwavering resolve. from documented truth, from the willingness to keep showing up, even when the system tells you not to. In your everyday life, you may not be a lawyer or a judge, but you are still part of this story. Every time you see someone being overlooked, spoken over, or wrongfully judged, your response matters, whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, or even at your kitchen table. Your voice carries weight. Justice isn't just won in courtrooms, it's protected in conversations, in policies, in hiring decisions, in how we teach our children and treat our neighbors. Jordan Harris's story should not be extraordinary, it should be the norm, that when injustice is exposed, accountability follows. That when someone is wrongfully accused, they are believed, defended, and ultimately freed. That those who misuse power face the consequences, no matter how high their seat is. So let this story stay with you. Let it challenge you to ask hard questions. Let it move you to action, not just awareness. And if this story shook you, inspired you, or reminded you of the kind of world we all deserve to live in, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel. Help us keep these stories alive. Share them. Talk about them, because change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we tell the truth, and keep telling it, until the world can no longer look away.